Or do you want me to tell you?
Well, start telling us some of the stories about some of the people on the wall.
Okay. Right at the very top is my grandfather, who was known as J.G., John Gillespie. And he was quite a person in the Masonic Brotherhood. So he's wearing his best apron in the photograph. And Grandma's looking very Victorian, sitting coyly next to him in another little picture. Below them are their 3 daughters. They only had girls. Auntie Cicely was the eldest one, and my mother was the youngest one, Hilda, Evelyn. And on the other side, that is one who is known as G. G for Gertrude. She hated the name, so she was always Auntie G, and she was a farmer's wife. Auntie Cicely was a teacher, and my mother was a homemaker. She played the piano very well, but she got married and had children and didn't actually get a degree in piano. And her husband had a fine voice, so one of the evening entertainments was my mother playing the piano and my father singing "Come into the Garden Maud" and things like that. Then, a little to the right on the wall, I have my other grandparents, who were Ben and Alice Francis, for whom I was named, except my Alison was the name of the manager of the Cromwell Inn, which is on the High Street in Stevenage still, a very fine hotel. And it was pronounced in those days Alison, so my nickname was A, of course. But I didn't get to be Alison until I was 18 and living in London, where Alison was a bit too posh. My father had 3 brothers. One of them died in World War I, beg your pardon, and another died somewhere in the Suez Canal area. He was a builder. And my father was the 3rd brother, and he worked in London in bank security. And his younger brother was Wilfred Nye Mallett, and he was manager of the Bank of Rio and in Brazil for many years. Grandpa, he used to love puzzles. He also wrote a lot of poetry, and some of it related to all the young men who were dying in World War I, who came from the little town where they lived, because the casualties were so high in World War I. It was very sad. He used to ride a penny farthing bicycle when he was romancing with Minnie Big, would you believe it? So it wasn't funny in those days, but nowadays Minnie Big sounds it's really funny. Anyhow, she was a sweetheart. She used to teach us to play cards, and if we couldn't get the cards to work out, we had little cheats so that the game always ended happily. I think it's a game of bezique where you have 2 packs of cards and the kings and queens get married and all sorts of things. Our family benefited from the fact that Auntie Cicely was a school teacher and had no children, because she financed the education of Hilda and Edgar's children, most of it anyway, because by the time the 5th child came along, suddenly education was free in England at that time. So we're very grateful for her. So Christmas was always wonderful, because Granny would come and she would have this mason's pension, because she didn't have very much money. They lived in a little country house, Paslow Common, Ingatestone, Essex. and we would all get to stir the Christmas pudding mix after we'd seeded all the raisins. And Pauline, my big sister, learned to cook with Mother. But then George and Peter came next, and George had had kidney disease and was in bed eating potato, I think, and Marmite for about a year to recover from this kidney problem he had. And so he was never allowed to join the army. So he was in the Home Guard or through the war. And his brother Peter, he and I used to go fly his model aeroplane. We'd wind up the propeller and with a rubber band.
Oh, yes, a rubber band.
Yeah, they'd end up in the tree often. But he had a motorbike, and he took me on his motorbike to Paslow Common, one of the green little areas patching around the town. And one time he was going a little too fast, and his knee got a bit skinned, but I was okay. And of course I never told anybody that I rode on the back of the motorbike. That was a dead secret. So Peter, he did end up flying all his life, and it's very sad. When the jet engines came, there was Duxford was the Air Force base near to Baldock, which was up the Great North Road from Stevenage, and he got tinnitus very severely because when the jet engines came, it was such a loud noise, and he could never get the Harley Street people to grant him a special pension because of the tinnitus. It was so loud in his head that you could barely carry on a conversation on a telephone. And finally, sad day, when he was 60, they're just near the home where they lived in Devonshire, near Broadsands, which is a beautiful spot. There was a big viaduct with a rail line crossing the lower valley, and he fell from there and died. And that was a real tragedy. I asked a local person, where is St. Mary's Church? And it's up a little tiny lane, and it's still very much a place of worship, and his grave is still there. And Simon took me twice to England, and we weeded and got rid of the moss that grew up over the stones and polished them up as best we could. But my parents were cremated in Luton. Edgar Anthony, my father, died when he was 65. And it's the same year my little sister died. She was 36, I think it was. She had breast cancer. She was living in Baghdad. She came home to have surgery and then went back to Baghdad, and it had progressed through her body, and she came back to England and was treated, but she went back to Baghdad in a coma, and she's buried in St. Mary's Church in Baghdad in the central part. So she loved it there. It was beautiful. I had given her a set of blue enameled saucepans as a wedding present. Seems odd, but she loved those. And she used to sleep on top of the roof in the summer. And my father went with Mehdi Mohammed, his son-in-law, out shooting one day, and before they came back they hid the rifles away because the revolution was starting. There's a photograph of my father and a camel, and it looks as if he's sitting on the camel, but he's actually, the camel is sitting down too. So I always have a laugh of that. My father did actually serve just at the very end of World War I. There's a photograph of him in puttees and what have you, and he would have only been 17, approaching 18. And he went, I got a tie of his, which was from the Air Force before it became the Royal Air Force. And he used to go up in a plane and spot where the Germans were during World War I, and they'd tap it out in, what's that, Morse code, or put a flyer. They have these pigeons they used to attach messages to during the wartime. So he was a lookout, but then the war ended and all was over. And he married my mother when she was about 24, and he was 18, 19 probably, because their first child was born in 20. Yeah. So that's Mum and Dad's story.
That
was
remember
terrible.
Pearl Harbor?
I sure do, yes.
You were in England during Pearl Harbor, though.
Oh, yes.
But it was big news there.
Oh, my goodness, that's what brought America into the war.
Yes.
America was standing on one side, but they were supplying us with all sorts of stuff. And also the fact that a young boy was flat-footed and he wasn't accepted for the army. So he shot himself one Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock, just 2 houses from where I was living. It was Douglas Long who killed himself. I was a secretary, and I went to work in London, in Ironmonger Lane, which is very near to Mansion House in the centre of London. And while I was working for this elderly gentleman, I saw General Eisenhower get awarded the keys to the City of London. I didn't go up there until the war was nearly ended. And my sister Pauline had her appendix out, and she went to convalesce with Auntie Cicely and Grandma Gillespie in this little village in Essex, Paslow Common. So where you had to pump the water still. Anyhow, I went to stay with this place, Paslow Common, which isn't far from the Thames. And what, you've ever heard of doodlebugs? A doodlebug went right over the house. And I could hear it coming. I watched it coming. And then, when it was just going over the house, I ducked under the covers and went to the window the other side and waited. And the engine cut out. And you count about 4 or 5. Boom! So that was the nearest I got to a German. But then the V2s came, and they were the silent bombers. But fortunately, that didn't last very long because it was D-Day, and we'd stopped them from sending them over. But they were scary. And my husband, Kingsley, he was a medical student at that time, and he'd been up near Birmingham for part of his training, and then he came down, and he went down to the beaches to help the wounded get into ambulances and what have you. Dunkirk, yes, that must have been, yeah. So that was a good thing that he did, and he finished his training. He was an MD by the time he was 21, and he was 3 years older than me, so he must have been 27. I was 24 when we were married. And we got married in the only church that's within a parish in London, and that's St Bartholomew's the Less. It's a little church just inside the gateway. Yeah.
Do you remember when you first saw him or first met him?
Yes, it was over the operating table.
Oh, fascinating. So you met him while you guys were working on somebody, huh?
Well, I just remember Simon's birth because somebody came up and held up a teapot while he was in the theatre operating. I was a nurse, and on the aerodromes, the pilots cannot take off unless there's a doctor on the premises. So he became the doctor on the premises so that the flyboys could take off and do their thing. And of course it meant sitting in a little tin hut somewhere eating sandwiches. So that's when he expanded. His uniform would barely fit around him after a while. But we've got those pictures, photographs of him with the squadron. And then it became the Auxiliary Air Force, and he stayed with them. And Church Fenton was the name of the aerodrome where the boys took off. He loved a good time. He used to go every weekend, and one weekend he forgot there was a right-hand turn, and there was a little house which was the house of an undertaker. I didn't know what an undertaker was in those days. Anyhow, the nice car that he was driving, it was a magnet, very beautiful car. And he squashed the front porch in with the bonnet of the little car, and he didn't get hurt, but the car got a bit smushed, and so all was well. He managed to drive home, but that was after partying with the boys at the aerodrome. He loved going to these parties with the boys, and it was every weekend for a long time. And I went there one day, and they had a glider, and a guy took me up in a glider, which was lovely. There's no sound, just the wind, and you're floating like a bird. And then all of a sudden, the nose went down, and I screamed. And the pilot was just having fun. Oh dear.
Historically, what shocked you most, Pearl Harbor or 9/11?
Oh, 9/11. My goodness, it was right there. That was just so, seeing all the bodies falling down. Yeah. And Lowell's son, he was going to have a meal in the building that morning, and the first one hit, and he turned around and walked all the way back to where he lived up in Greenwich Village, earth shaking. We were emigrating, and we came on the Liberté, which is the picture in the bedroom. Mm-hmm. And the Liberté didn't do many more to cross Atlantic visits, because you could fly in a day and not spend 5 days on board a liner, and also hit the North Sea storms occasionally. So on the Liberté, of course, I was a bit surprised to find that they spoke French. And I had my little schoolgirl French to work with, and I had a baby, and I didn't have baby food with me. So the baby was fed with mashed potatoes and milk, because that was the nearest thing, for 5 days, and it survived. And Simon, when he was older, he was very mad that he'd been made a citizen of the US of A without his permission. So this is a hummingbird. We haven't actually given it a name, but it was made by Nick a couple of years ago, and I enjoy having it in a place of honor because I think it's so beautiful.
Simon, Nick, and Karen. Who's
Just-
your favorite?
Yes, absolutely, yes. She's our American baby, so she had to be spoiled.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the other two were born in England.
One was born in London within the sound of Bow Bells, and he will deny being a Cockney.
Yes.
And Nick is a Yorkshireman. He
Yeah.
was born right in a little maternity hospital about 100 yards from where we were living at the top of a hill and in Leeds. Of course, Leeds has changed so much. There are
Yeah.
one-way streets and what have you.
What makes you proud of your children?
Oh, I'm proud of all of them. My eldest is working so hard, doing research for a long time and teaching students the wonders of nature and in biology and microscopics. Yes, make it come alive for the students. Has a very,
So which one is that? That's Simon?
at Simon, a very great number of pre-vets or pre-medi nurses and doctors, what have you, in his
Biology classes.
biology classes, right? Microbiology. Then Nick has he is great with figures. He's always been able to work out figures. So he'd had a problem with reading at a young age, and we used to read stories together. I'd do 2 pages, and he would struggle with 1 page, and he made it so that he's a good writer and reader now, and I'm very proud of him for doing that. And he works in the banking world and has a fine a wife and 1 little imp of a red-headed granddaughter.
Jessica.
Yes, very bright.
What are you proudest about for Karen?
Well,
About Karen?
because she's such a loving person.
Yes.
Yes, and she remembers things for me and does things for me which I'm not aware of, and it makes me very happy to be with. Yeah, and I've got the most gorgeous crochet, a mat, what do you call that big,
Oh,
with a little
yes,
bird.
Lace, a bit of lace.
A piece of lace
Yes.
is so beautiful, yes. Yes, so these little treasures that she's left, because she's always been so diligent in completing what she starts,
Yes.
and doesn't leave anything undone, and thinks of everybody around her to make them happy. You really do. I'm very, very fond, to say the least. Very fond. Perfect daughter. Thank you, sweetheart. Yeah, she's my other sweetheart.
That's awesome.
The thing about life is that it's a gift, of course, but as you get older, you're the only one who's left still to hold the fort. And so family is so very precious. And every minute I spend with my family, I'm so proud of where they are in the world, that the people around them are happy and contented and giving, loving people, and that makes a difference in the world as it is today. So I think of them all as loving and kind and very, I don't know that they're all very happy all the time, but they're struggling, some of them, but they're making an impression on the world as it is where they are now. God bless them all.